Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalumbrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast. Today's episode is a more conversational approach to the information you can find in my 2-volume set titled What is Existentialism? If you'd like to pick up a copy, I put my affiliate link in the show description, so you can pick up a copy at Amazon. I plan to use some technical terminology in this episode, but I'll rephrase my statements to make it easier to understand what I'm saying. The most technical terms I'll be using are ontology and paradigm. A paradigm is just a constellation of philosophical theorems and ideas. I have full episodes on YouTube explaining those terms in depth. So here we go. The so-called greatest experts around the world on the topic of existentialism have always been unanimous that there is no such thing as existentialism. Philosophy professor Dr. Richard Schacht famously stated in the Cambridge Companion to Existentialism, quote, "If existentialism is defined as what Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre have in common, it becomes a word with little, if any, positive meaning, because they would seem to have little more in common than a critical relationship to classical modern philosophy. If, on the other hand, it is defined as the totality of what and how they think, the upshot would be utterly incoherent," end quote. Now, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Schacht and many other professors of existentialism. However, anyone who thinks this way is wrong. And after 20 years of working on the question, what is existentialism, I am the first person in the history of philosophy. I know saying that upsets some people, but it is true. I am the first person in the history of philosophy to answer the question, what is existentialism? So to address Dr. Schacht's statement directly, what those existentialists, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre, what those existentialists have in common is that they participate in the Kantian Copernican revolution. And it is the structure of the transcendental philosophy as a totality that allows us to map the existentialists along with their differences regarding what and how they think. In fact, approaching existentialism as if it were simply philosophizing about a set of themes or in terms of some aspect of Heidegger's or Sartre's philosophy without recognizing Kant's transcendental philosophy as the deepest background to all the existential philosophies is precisely why the question, what is existentialism, seems unanswerable. But let's back up a little and take a conversational pace here. So the question we can start with is, what are the different ways to attempt to answer the question, what is existentialism? And notice that we could consider all of the philosophy or literary texts that talk about existence. We could consider the writings of thinkers who have talked about it, or we could inquire into what ontological paradigm, what ontology must be used to participate in existential philosophy. Those amount to 3 primary ways to approach answering the question, what is existentialism? And the easiest way to think about this is by a process of elimination. In other words, think about what is not existentialism, and then you can begin to zero in on what is existentialism. For example, talking about possible worlds is not existentialism. since existentialism focuses on actuality, what actually exists, not what possibly exists. We can talk about possibility, of course, but always with actuality as the ground. So we could focus on philosophy texts or philosophers or on ontological paradigms. I actually focus on all three. However, the texts and philosophers should be considered as they relate to the ontological paradigm that existentialism must be. That is, the ontological paradigm that truly identifies existence and takes it as a point of departure for philosophizing. This is because the ontological paradigm is technically what defines existentialism. What we know for sure is that the paradigm for existentialism was not made explicit until 1781. However, what we refer to as the perennial philosophy, which begins with Plato and is still alive today, is a possible candidate also for the origin of existentialism. But the problem with including the perennial philosophy in the paradigm of existentialism is that the paradigm of perennial philosophy is not explicit. It requires some interpretation to determine its paradigm. Okay, so when we look at the paradigm of existentialism, we can identify where it differs from other paradigms. This is that process of elimination again. Knowing those essential distinctions also allows you to identify the essence of a paradigm. This is what we mentioned earlier. So what then is the essence of existentialism? The paradigm of existentialism differs from other philosophies given how it thinks of existence. The way to arrive at this answer is to take the essential distinction, that is, the essential points that differentiate existentialism from other philosophies, and turn them inside out. In other words, we arrive at those points by comparing existentialism to other philosophies. But once we've arrived at those points, then we consider them points around which to organize the writings and ideas of the existentialists. This can be experimental at first, if you're still skeptical, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And this is the correct method for answering the question, what is existentialism? Like I said before, so-called expert philosophy professors don't know this about existentialism. The reason I was able to identify this, not to discount any form of divine intervention, was because I spent so much time studying the scientific structure of psychology. By studying the scientific structure of psychology, I became much more comfortable thinking in terms of paradigms. And of course, the paradigms of psychology are determined by philosophical principles.
This is Mark.
And this is Wes.
We'd like to tell you about Close Reads,
a philosophy podcast where we comment on philosophy texts in real time.
We give you the experience of reading very difficult verbiage without you having to actually do that.
We cover the big names and the figures you've always wanted to know more about.
And share our insights from 15 years running the Partially Examined Life podcast, downloaded over 50 million times.
Join us
on Close Reads.
The people I know who have read my 2-volume set on existentialism are now able to formulate very high-level thoughts regarding existentialism as a philosophy and as a paradigm for psychotherapy and psychology. I'll put a link to the books in the show description. Now, once you have identified these principles, by turning the points of essential distinction inside out, you also notice these principles can be grouped into constitutional and actualization or actualizational principles. The constitutional principles are mystery, freedom, mineness, that's M-I-N-E-ness, and anxiety. Mystery, freedom, mineness, and anxiety. The actualizational principles are authenticity, integrity, and sincerity. It should come as no surprise that the professors advocating for a post-human world reject sincerity. They say things like, quote, sincerity no longer exists, end quote, which is ironically false and kind of silly for a philosophy professor to say. But they say it. Finally, then, let's just say a little bit more about each of the principles of existentialism. We'll start with mystery. If a philosophy does not consider existence to be mysterious, then it is not an existential philosophy. How mysterious is understood here is the subtitle of the mystery principle. That subtitle is Existence Exceeds Consciousness. There's more than what meets the eye or the other senses as well. This should be obvious, but philosophers who philosophize like Descartes did often overestimate the power of consciousness to lay existence bare. Let's look at the other principles along with their subtitles. Freedom, or meaning making. This is the freedom to determine and to understand one's own life. In other words, no matter what is done to you, you are free to understand it as you will. And you are free to make choices in relation to it that determine the course of your life. As Sartre put it, freedom is inescapable. Mineness, or the mineness of existence over worldliness. There is a spectrum that can be illuminated that ranges from an individual's private interpretation of events to what we could call the worldly interpretation of events. This is the easiest to see when you consider the next two principles, anxiety and authenticity. For all three of these principles, then, let's look at Heidegger's term, being in the world. And think of a spectrum that runs from being on the one end to the world on the other. When we determine meaning and when we become anxious, we do so by concerning ourselves and caring in a way that is directed either more toward being than world or more toward world than being. Mineness refers to concern and care that is directed toward being. Anxiety that is directed toward mineness can provide the special existentialist revelation that emphasized being despite being in the world. Finally, then, we have the actualization principles: authenticity, integrity, and sincerity. Authenticity refers to being in the world in terms of being more than in terms of the world. Integrity refers to the resolution to be in the world more in terms of being than the world. And sincerity holds being in focus while we are being in the world by being toward death. And that's the earlier, I had just mentioned, the special existentialist idea. Of course, it's being toward death. Now, being toward death is a special existential mode of being because being toward death acknowledges the mystery of being and freedom and death. This provokes anxiety, which, to use some Heideggerian terminology here, this provokes anxiety which reveals Dasein's mineness of being. From the revelation of one's mineness of being, one is then able to be more authentic with integrity and sincerity. You're able to be more in relation to your being than in relation to a worldly interpretation of your being. Now, I worked very hard to sum it up in one sentence. This sentence is the title of Volume 2, Section 9, and that sentence is, authenticity, integrity, and sincerity as the resolution of the anxiety of mindness regarding freedom and mystery. So this is a very brief and conversational approach to answering the question, what is existentialism? For the more detailed version filled with scholarly references, you can purchase my 2-volume set, What is Existentialism, from Amazon. If you post questions or comments on my YouTube videos, I will try to answer them as soon as I can. I hope this helps you understand existentialism. I'll see you in the future. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalumbrino, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.